I'm going to take you through Game 7 of the World Chess Championship. In Game 6, the world champion Magnus Carlsen made the big breakthrough. He won. So he's 1 up in the match. So the question was, could Nepo hit back in the next game? It's going to be tough. The players finished Game 6 at midnight in Dubai. They then had the press conference, then had to go back to the hotel and find something to eat, and then try to get to sleep, prepare for the next game, and here we are, Game 7. Let's see what happened. So the challenger, Nepomniachtchi, with the white pieces, and it's an exact repeat of the line that they played in Game 5. So it's a Spanish. This is a very well-trodden path that they're going down, the absolute main line of the Spanish. Castle's kingside for black. And basically that means that black is ready to play the so-called Marshall Gambit after this pawn move c3, and this is the famous Marshall Gambit. But instead of that, Nepo played the so-called, or one of the many anti-Marshall variations. So this disturbs this pawn on b5, and black has to decide how to deal with this threat to take. And Carlsen repeated this line from Game 5. Now, I find this a slightly odd continuation because it cedes control of this A file, gives white's rook the possibility perhaps later on to invade somewhere on the rook's file. Now all these squares are covered at the moment, but one never knows. It's an unusual variation, but so far Carlsen is proving that it is quite playable for black. So pawn to h3. This is a kind of preemptive move. Pawn to d6, so all the same as Game 5. And in Game 5, Nepo played pawn to c3. And, well, it was quite an interesting game. He got some advantage. In this game, he played pawn to d3. So much calmer, just content with this strong pawn chain. Pawn to h6 from Carlsen. This can be a useful move. And now knight c3. So instead of putting that pawn on c3, the knight comes here and is looking to hop into d5. So if, for example, bishop e6, that's the move you want to play to neutralize this bishop, then the knight comes in, and that's a little bit annoying for black. So Carlsen played rook e8. So now we can see how this is a useful move, this h6 move, because white doesn't have this move knight g5 available to attack that pawn here. And Nepo continued with his strategy, knight d5. And if this is exchanged off, then this is a little bit uncomfortable for black. This bishop looks very nice. Possibility to play here, maybe d4. White definitely has a little something in that position. But after knight d5, Carlsen thought for about 5 minutes and played bishop to f8. So very solid indeed, just making sure that bishop steps out of range of the knight. And this little sort of curl up with rook here and then bishop back, such a common idea in the Spanish. And that bishop, though it doesn't seem to be doing much at the moment, covers this important square, so it makes the king feel sort of more secure. Nepo exchanged on f6 and played c3, so he's preparing to advance with pawn to d4. And this knight could be on a better square. So Carlsen thought for about 20 minutes here and played knight to e7. And this also means that this prepares the way for this pawn. Excuse me a second. So if, for example, pawn to d4, then c5 starts to attack white's centre, prepares perhaps to push on again. This is Very typical Spanish strategy. So moving the knight back, very sensible. It's also going to swing round to the king side as well. And in combination with the queen, black might be able to get some kind of counter-attack on the king side. So that's a nice manoeuvre, knight e7. So Nepo thought for about 10 minutes, played bishop e3. Okay, solid development, and perhaps looking to hit the rook here. Bishop e6. Well, this is a very important move in the Spanish. If you can successfully neutralize white's bishop here, then black makes a big step in the defense, basically. It's going to be very hard for white to really develop an attack once these bishops are exchanged. So this is good strategy. Pawn to d4. So at least Nepo has managed to come forward in the centre. And I was perhaps anticipating pawn to c6 just to stop this pawn advancing. But Magnus thought for about 9 minutes here and came up with this move. A little bit surprising. Normally you don't want to give up your pawn centre. But it creates a few difficulties, actually. And we can see that although this rook is rather masked at the moment by these pieces, very soon that rook is going to come into play. Let's see what happens. So Nepo played the sensible move, the orthodox move, maintaining those two lovely pawns in the middle of the board. So at first glance, you can see those pawns control all these squares, and that looks pretty nice for white. But let's see what Carlsen has in mind. So he exchanged bishops and then played the knight to g6. So this rook, which was blocked in behind those pieces, has now a threat to take that pawn on e4. And now there's counterplay. And in combination with the queen and knight, actually looks as though, well, white has to be a little bit careful here. I mean, certainly this bishop doesn't want to have to drop back in order to protect that pawn. That doesn't look nice. So here, well, a big think from Nepo. Almost 18 minutes. And I suspect it was at this moment that he thought, well, I really don't have much advantage here, if any. And perhaps it is time to compromise. And I think the previous day had a bearing on his thoughts here. He played rook ec1. He could have played rook ac1 and gone in for this. And this rook looks quite active. I mean, that can be countered with this one. But white has a tiny bit of pressure there. I think black is solid enough. It's very hard for white to make progress. But if you're going to go for the win, then that might be a way to do it. But in that 18-minute think, I suspect Nepo just thought, well, it's too little. It's too thin if I have anything there at all. So he played this move. And now Carlsen played this move, pawn to c5. Now, he'd obviously calculated this out beforehand. And this is an excellent move that simplifies the position. So if, let's say, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, and rook takes pawn on e4, and basically black has equalized straight away. You can see an equal exchange of pawns. The whole position has cleared, and there's not a lot going on there. Incidentally, that's why playing the other rook, leaving the rook on e1, actually would deter that pawn break c5, because the rook on e1 would have covered the pawn on e4. So c5, an excellent move from Carlsen, and he even threatens to perhaps gain the initiative with this move. So Nepo played pawn to e5. Now, well, he's trying to stir up a bit of trouble. You know, if pawn takes pawn, then pawn takes c5. That might be an interesting passed pawn there. But Carlsen had obviously anticipated this move e5, and he played Queen to f5. Played it fairly quickly. Good move. So sharply played by Carlsen and well played. And if pawn takes pawn here, then black actually gets the initiative. This pawn is going to be recovered, and black will stand well with those dangerous pawns on the queen side. So that's why pawn takes pawn here was played by Nepo. And again, this just simplifies the position. So Carlsen exchanged the bishops, then he recaptured the pawn on e5. Well, you can see the whole central position has just cleared after these exchanges. So it's almost symmetrical pawn structure. Neither side has anything to play for here, particularly with just major pieces on the board with queens and rooks. Nothing to do. And here, well, it was quite clear that they were just going through the motions, playing down to a draw, and now it's even more drawn with 3v3 on the king side. And there's this rule they have in these World Championship games. The players are not allowed to agree a draw before move 40. So what the players did was they just played the moves out. We're on move 37 now. You can see nothing much is going on here. And they didn't even go for a repetition of moves. They got to move 40. And with this 41st move, Nepomniachtchi offered a draw, which Carlsen accepted. That's move 41. Well, it was quite clear in the press conference afterwards that both players were really tired after the long game from yesterday. Remember, they played almost 8 hours, 136 moves, the longest game in World Chess Championship history. Carlsen said he was a little better and I had to equalise. I couldn't sleep yesterday. I was way too excited. I know that really well. Often if I've won a really nice game, a game I'm really proud of, then I find it really hard to actually come down and to sleep. You know, you're full of adrenaline. That's what Carlsen had. It's also pretty difficult if you lost the horrible game because it's just churning over in your mind as well. Nepo said it was quite a new experience to play 2 games on the same day. So that's a reference to the fact that they finished yesterday's game at midnight and then they had to play this same day. So yeah, 2 very tired players, and at a certain moment both players just thought, right, let's drift towards a draw. So let's look at the scores. There we go. We're at the halfway stage in the match. They've played 7 out of the 14 games. Magnus Carlsen is a goal up at half time. Quick look at the match schedule. You'll see that they play game 8 tomorrow. So not much rest for them. Game 8 tomorrow starting 16:30 in Dubai. So will Jan Nepomniachtchi come out in the second half and try to press straight away, or will he just take it easy? Remember, he's only 1 down. There are still 7 games to go, so he shouldn't go crazy. He shouldn't go on tilt. He still has time. Anyway, join me for the recap for tomorrow's game, and thanks very much for watching.